and because the town was so tiny, it was exposed to many other different influences. And when the Jews came back, they were very influenced by the Zionists. So I just wanted to read you this part about the Zionists. The Zionist organizations in the town. Okay, so each one according to his in Istrich, most of the youth belong to the Zionist organizations like Gordonia, Hatzomer, Hatzair, Hechalutz, Dror, Hamizrachi, Hapoel Hamizrachi, Benot Agudat Hamizrachi, Benot Agunat Israel, Hanoar Hatzioni, Boslia, the Association of the Workers of Zionists, and the 9 Zionist Labor Party, known with the initials Ayin Yud, Aleph Yud, Ayin Pei. The party was persecuted by the authority that claimed they were communists. And to understand to the degree that the Polish authorities fought communism and how far anti-Semitism was involved in this war, it would be interesting to remember the words of the local police chief that said in an anti-Semitic tone, "Every communist is a Jew." I just want to tell you one more story, and then I'm going to actually let my father speak and let you guys ask questions, okay? So, in Europe at that time, they had what they called Luftmenschen. Luftmenschen is somebody who lives off the air. And these people just actually wandered from town to town, seeing if they could find work, food for a day or two. They went somewhere else. It was just, there was no way for a Jew to make a living. They were forbidden from farming. They were forbidden from holding any kind of weaponry. They couldn't get government jobs. They couldn't work in the refinery in this town. The town was mainly a town of industry and refineries. They couldn't work in the refineries, so they worked mostly in trades. So my grandmother used to take in people to sleep over, just to give them a place to sleep for the evening. And my father's job was to get the straw. So, they would have a bed. And he hated that job. And his mother used to say to him, you'll be glad one day when somebody will give you a bed and give you a place to sleep. And there were many nights during the war where he slept out in the haystacks in the Russian winter in the farms. And he was glad because it was a place where they could sleep, where nobody bothered them. The other thing I wanted to tell you was that the reason that Jews were so decimated during the war was that they had no way to defend themselves. They had no guns. Legally, they were not allowed to hold guns in Poland. And you know what? That is my lesson that I learned. That the only way the Jews can go forward is to be able to defend themselves, and thank God we have a state today where we can defend ourselves, where nobody can ever do this to us again. So I'm going to let my father talk now. You can ask him questions. He'll answer questions before the war, after the war. My husband just asked me to mention that you know, he was a partisan during the war. He was in the DP camps after the war. He took people over the mountains to Italy. He put them on boats. He was on a boat and went to Cyprus because they wouldn't let him into Israel, and he was in Israel after the war. Okay, I'm going to open it up to you guys, and you can ask questions, and I may read some more from the information I have. But who wants to start? Any questions? Yeah.
Was your father actually in one of the camps?
No. Yes.
What's Cyprus?
What is Cyprus? Cyprus is an island in the Mediterranean, and when the British, who were just as much to blame for the loss of Jewish lives as the Germans, because they closed all the borders, they didn't allow Jews to escape from Poland. They could have saved millions of lives, and instead they turned their back on the Jews in every way possible. During World War II and after the war, when they supported the Arabs in every way possible. So after World War II, when Jews tried to get to Israel, after they had lost everything, and the British would turn them back on the shores of Israel. Some people got through, but most people did not, and they put them in a holding camp in Cyprus. They put people who had spent years in Auschwitz and in concentration camps and hiding in the woods and who had gone through every sort of horror. They took them and they put them in another camp on the island of Cyprus, which is somewhere between Greece and Turkey. It's an island that's been disputed for years and years. And they held them there until the state was created in 1948.
Was it like a camp where like they could live like normal lives, or was it still like?
No, it wasn't a concentration camp. They didn't have forced labor there, but they were held in a certain area, and they were not allowed to go out. You know. Yes.
Did your father feel more oppressed by the Russians or the Germans?
Dad, you want to answer? Did you feel more oppressed by the Russians or the Germans?
The Germans were the worst ones.
Yeah, but the Russians were not good either.
The Russians wasn't good, no, they could exist. With the Germans, there was no existing at all. They didn't want Jews whatsoever.
Did your father ever go back to Europe after the war to see how everything was?
Did you go back to Europe? Did you go back to Istria?
He went not far, Shemesh. It's a different town.
But actually, I have pictures of my father.
That's according what year you're talking about.
Yeah, but actually I have pictures of my father in Litovisk where they were burying somebody with the matzeva, and they had to take the matzevot away because if they didn't, the Poles would desecrate the grave. The reason the person was dead, and it's happened in many places in Europe after the war, there were many pogroms against Jews. The most famous one was in Kielce. But, you know, if Jews came back to their homes and the Poles didn't like it, they didn't want to give the Jews back their homes because they had taken everything. They took their clothes, they took their furniture, they took everything. And, you know, if the Jews came to claim it, they killed them. Just like before the war. Nobody knew about it. It was just like it didn't even happen. I mean, after they killed over 6 million people, they were still killing Jews. Yes?
Can your father tell us a few stories about him being a partisan?
Can you tell anything about being a partisan?
Well, he was mostly in the woods. He was just trying to survive, really. The we didn't fight too much. Some of them did. Just, it wasn't organized. It was coming together, people together, some of them from each towns and cities. They survived in the woods. Most of them is in the woods.
Yes.
What did it was your mother in one of the camps or like part of the Holocaust? Or?
No, my mother was here. My mother left Europe the last day in July of '39. And she was just incredibly lucky. She came here. Of course, that wasn't easy either because nobody knew what was happening. She got a few letters from her mother, and that was it. I don't even have copies of them. You know, it was just a situation where nobody knew what was going on. You know, nobody, and especially in Europe, nobody knew where to run. Nobody knew if it was good to stay, if it was good to go. If it was good to go, which direction was it good to go? And if you were going to go, you needed money. You know, you needed transportation. And how were you going to go? You needed supplies. I mean, it was chaos. It was absolute chaos. Nobody knew where to run. In fact, I'll tell you a story that one of my father's brothers was on a train. They emptied, the area where my parents lived was a very industrial area. It had refineries and sawmills, and when the Russians were there, they wanted everybody out only so they could operate and do what they needed to do. They emptied 1 million people out of that area in a weekend. They took them by train. Most of them ended up in Siberia. So when people tell you about Palestinian refugees, remember how 1 million people left one place in one weekend. So my uncle was on the train, and my grandmother bribed somebody to get him off the train. And he did get off the train. Maybe 10 people got off the train. So, you know, a lot of people survived in Siberia. It wasn't an easy life, but, you know, people could survive there. So who knows? Maybe he would have survived and maybe he wouldn't have. But definitely in Istria, it was impossible. Yes?
When did your parents reunite?
My mother wrote to my father in the DP camps, and then she kept writing to him. She came to Israel, I think in 49 or 50. They were married, and she decided she didn't want to live in Israel, so they came here and they made a life here. Back there?
Were the people in Istria aware of concentration camps?
I don't know. Daddy, were the people, did they know about the concentration camps in Istria before you left?
It was no we knew it's in Germany. There was a concentration camp till they came into Poland. Then they organized their concentration camps too.
Yeah, but you know, the Germans were in that town for 6 weeks. So, although they didn't wreak the kind of havoc that they wreaked, you know, when they came in 41, they, you know, they started, you know, their stuff. You know, they took, in fact, my father was, you know, in a labor brigade. They took some people that were, I think they didn't have papers, and they threw them off a bridge like 46 people. Things like that. So, you know, the Jews understood. So don't ever let people tell you that, you know, nobody knew what was happening. People did understand what was happening. And then the Russians came back into that town because there was a pact between the Germans and the Russians in 39. And that ended in 41 when there was a big break between Hitler and Stalin. When that happened, the Germans came back into that town and the Russians were pushed back east. So I'm trying to think why I started telling you this, but people did understand what was happening. They didn't understand the extent of that, you know, of what was going to happen. But they did understand that the Germans were bad. Yes.
You mentioned how your grandmother bribed somebody to get your uncle off the train. So, who did she bribe? How did she bribe him? And
You know what? I don't know. It was probably a Russian guard or something. You know, all the Russians took bribes. It was not unusual.
And what was he bribed with?
Probably money, food, whatever they had. You know, there were times when people just traded things. Yeah. Yes.
2 things. One, why did she want him to get off the train?
Well, because nobody understood. Nobody knew what was going to be. Nobody knew where it was safe. And you know what? People had a great desire to stay together. In fact, there's a famous story by Elie Wiesel that, you know, somebody who worked for them offered them a place to hide, maybe like 12 miles away from the Germans. And they would have been fine and safe there, but she only had place for 1 or 2 of them. She didn't have place for the entire family. And Elie Wiesel's father refused that offer of help because he didn't want to break up his family. And a lot of people felt the same. They felt that if they stayed together, they were safer. And what was your other question?
And what's a DP camp?
A DP camp is a displaced person camp. Because there were thousands of Jews who were displaced after the war. They couldn't go back to where they came from because the Poles would kill them if they came to take their property and their homes. They weren't allowed to go to Israel because the British closed off all the routes to Israel. And so what were they going to do with all these people? But unlike other people, you know what? They made a life for themselves and they went places. And you know what? Many people after the war did not talk about the war. I mean, it would have been much easier for my father to talk about the war in 1949 when he remembered things fresh. In fact, this morning I asked him, when he left Istria, he went to see if he could find Mendel's brother-in-laws. He had 2 young, his wife had 2 younger brothers, and he wanted to take them with him where he was going. He didn't know where he was going, but he wanted to take them with them. And you know what? He couldn't remember the name of the town. But you know what? Nobody was interested in 1946, in 1949. You know what people used to say to people, you know, survivors? They used to say, forget about the war. The war is over. Or even worse, they would say things like, how come you survived and my brother did not? Like, is it somebody else's fault that their brother did not survive? Nobody wanted to hear about it. People were tired of the war. And you know what? They went on and they did what they had to do, and they earned a living, and they raised their children to be good, proud Jews. And you know what? In one way that was a good thing, but in one way it was a bad thing because there was no discussion of what happened during the war. Nobody cared. Nobody wanted to talk about it. You know what? Even in high school, I remember going into world history. I was like, because I was always interested. I was like, now I'll hear something about it. Now I'll know what happened. And you know what? It wasn't even mentioned in the world history books. Not even mentioned. Somebody here had a question? Yes.
How did your father get food while he was living in the forest?
How did you get food while you were in the forest?
Huh?
How did you get food while you were in the forest?
Food from local people. Sometimes we took it, sometimes people gave us. Local people. We were moving from one place to another one. From the area.
Believe me, they were never in the same place 2 days in a row. And you know what? They did what they had to do. Sometimes people, were nice and they, gave them food and they felt sorry for them. And other times, they took the food that they needed. Yes?
Oh yeah. Did your mother know your father's father or his family
Yes.
before the war?
Yes. Yes. I think they knew each other's family, but it wasn't like, I don't know how to say it. It's like, I met somebody, one time at a baseball game, or, I saw them around, maybe I saw them in the restaurant, it wasn't like, they knew each other and they were on a first name basis. It was just kind of a very far relationship, like I remember him, kind of thing. Yes?
How old were your parents during the Holocaust?
My father was 20, my father was 19 and 39, and my mother was 20 years old, and no, she was born in 17, she was 22 years old in 1939, yes?
How did your father come to be a partisan?
How did you come to be a partisan, Daddy?
From the local people, we got together, the times was bad, and we just decided was up to the individual. If he wants to live a bad life, nobody knows what will happen, harm to him. We trying to save ourselves as much as possible.
Yes.
How old was your father when he became a partisan?
So he was, I want to say 41, right, 23. Yes.
Did your father come across any Nazis while hiding? And if so, did he kill any?
So, did you come across Nazis while you were hiding? Did you kill any?
Oh yes, we was come across Nazis.
Did you kill any?
Did you kill any?
This is personal.
We won't tell anybody.
We're amongst friends.
Thank God.
When your father came to America, did he experience anti-Semitism?
Did you experience anti-Semitism here?
Here in the United States? Well, it's not much. It happens once in a while. You can, especially when you don't speak good English and things like that. That happens, just not much.
Yes.
The main thing is the government that's against it.
Yes.
When you would hide, do you see any other Jewish people besides the people who was with any kids in the woods or something? Because there's some kids in the woods that would probably hide in there for food.
Did you see kids in the woods?
Huh?
Did you see kids when you were a partisan in the woods?
Did I
See children.
Did you see children?
Children in the woods. Were there Jewish
Yes,
children?
it was Jewish children. Yes.
In-
Not many, but it was.
In fact, my father told me a story that there was I think a grandmother and a 3-year-old child, and she went to sleep and they had some beans, you know, they used to call chickpeas babalach. And so she said to her grandmother, "Los me off a babalach for the morgen," which means leave me a few chickpeas for the morning, because they knew that food was so precious, you know, that it was like they thought about it all the time. You know, the Blozhever Rebbe was mentioned in a book by Yafa Aliyah, who is kind of the mother of Holocaust studies in the United States. She also comes from a Polish town. And his wife was remarked that a loaf of bread in Auschwitz was worth the price of the tallest skyscraper in Manhattan.
Can your father tell 1 or 2 stories that the kids would be able to take away with themselves? Take away. We'd love to hear from your father 1 or 2 stories.
Can you tell a story? Anything.
Well,
You could tell your daddy. You could tell the story about the girls who dressed up as peasants when the Germans came in, and the girls who dressed up as peasants. Do you remember?
oh,
Okay.
it was the Jewish girls, when the Germans came in, the Jewish girl dressed themselves in peasants' clothes. And they was going out from town and saving Jews who was going home. So the Germans wouldn't catch him and they wouldn't kill him. So they took him on a different road, into town, to home.
Do you understand what happened with the Germans? When people left their houses, and people were turning, when the Germans came in, people left their houses. And when the Jews wanted to return their houses, the Germans were there, and the Ukrainians and the Poles were identifying the Jews. They were helping the Germans identify the Jews so they would know who was Jewish. So and they were killing the Jews when they were returning to their houses. So the Jewish girls dressed up as peasants and took the Jews a different way so that they wouldn't run into the Germans and they wouldn't be killed. Yes.
When your father had to get food from local people while he was at Columbus, how long would it take? Like, was there food every day to eat? Was there every week?
Nobody knew.
To get food?
Nobody knew if there was food tomorrow or in 3 days. You know how Jews ate during the war? If somebody would find a barrel of pickles, they would eat the entire barrel of pickles. One time, can you tell the story about when you ate the pig fat? Can you tell the story about when you ate the pig fat?
Then I ate.
The pig fat? Remember, you found pig fat?
Oh yeah, we ate everything. There was no trefa kosher, some and a lot of places. No thing that's preserved. So pig fat, is it supposed to be? It's not kosher. No, it's very satisfying. You run for food, so it's very.
So
It's like you have to eat and you're hungry. You don't eat as much if you eat bread with pig fat or things like it.
So my father found pig fat. Somehow he got it, maybe from a local peasant or somebody, and he ate it. And he said to my husband, it was the best thing I had to eat during the war because it kept me going for 2 weeks. Yeah,
By the way, just according to halacha, when it's a matter of life or death, you can go ahead and eat whatever you need to eat.
absolutely.
So just be aware of it.
Yes,
Did your father ever have nightmares about?
yes. Yes,
Did your father ever like testify at a trial?
No. no, he did not. Nobody ever asked him, you know, it was just, I don't know, nobody ever asked for his memories. He was never, it was like unimportant. For some reason, he was just my father was always the gray man in the room. In fact, I remember, I think it was like, he just learned to blend in a way. I remember that there were riots in Harlem when I was a kid, like in '68. And he had a really cheap plum. My father, worked as a superintendent. He was always good with his hands. And he went down he had a really cheap plumbing supply in Harlem, and he wanted to go down there. I was like, Daddy, there are riots, He went down there, nobody touched him. I think you just learn to, become like the gray person. Nobody sees you. It's like riding on the subway. I don't know if ever, well, now the subway's okay to ride in, but people who remember when it wasn't so okay to ride in, you just become like the gray person in the room. Yeah.
When your mom was in the forest, did anyone like give you any hospitality besides the food? Like, if you could sleep anywhere?
Did people put you up to sleep when you were a partisan in the forest?
Well, it was good people, it was bad people. Always we find some good people. Without the good people, we couldn't survive.
So I just want to tell you that there was a Ukrainian doctor in Isterik, and he wasn't ever, super friendly with the Jews, but they picked him to be the mayor under the Germans, and you couldn't refuse, so he became the mayor, and so the main thing, that they wanted him to do was to write lists of Jews to be killed. The write lists of Jewish communists, right, whatever. So the doctor refused. He refused to make a list for them, and they killed him. And we just learned that some people just have in them the ability to be good and rise above the situation, and it doesn't matter if they're Jewish or not, and we just learned from that there are good people everywhere. Just, we need to find them. Yes?
What were your father's feelings on like religion and God after?
What are your feelings about religion and God?
Oh, there's a God. There's a God all the time.
Can your father explain that, what he means by that?
Can you explain that a little?
Well, we get up in the morning, God helps us to get up, we dress, we wash ourselves, we clean ourselves, we say brachot to God. There is a God. There's some higher than we are here on the ground. You have to say Baruch Yom Yom.
Okay. Was your father, when he was in the woods, was he ever with anyone? Like, was he with people, and if so, was he with anyone that ever got like ill or ever like in the forest, but then like they like went through it, I guess?
Were people ill in the forest and they got better?
Yeah?
Were people sick in the forest and they got better? When you were a partisan, did people get sick and then get better?
It's some people, yes, some people not. It wasn't, the medicine wasn't as good. It's, some people died account of the illness because in the woods, in the population would, if they would have doctor medicine, then possibly much more people would live. There was no such a good medicine, doctors like it's today here.
I just want to say one thing back. Somebody asked about children in the forest. You know that Abraham Foxman, who was the head of ADL, he just retired a year or two ago, was hidden in by Christians, and his father came to get him, and he walked into a shul. I think it was right at the end of the war, and people started crying because they hadn't seen a Jewish child in so long.
There's a song by A.B. Rottenberg that he wrote about a Sefer Torah, that there was no Sefer Torah in Simchat Torah, and they danced with a child and they twirled them around and around because that's how precious Jewish children were there. Can your father tell us some like life lessons or things that I know Bucky mentioned? Your father has a couple of life lessons or ways that he approaches every Jew, you know, and because of the war that he feels very strongly about that.
Can you tell us the lessons that you learned, the way you approach life after the war, and the way about what you think about Jews after the war?
We all brothers and sisters Jews. And we all together inside. The Jews helped us all the time. We all the time getting together.
My father always says because my husband is, he's like, always says, oh, this one, the reform, the this, the that, well, I'm not going to include the exaltating Jews in that group. But my father says every Jew is dear and holy to us. Because you know what? We don't have enough Jews after the war. Believe me, if every Jew from Europe had gone to Israel, there would be no doubt about the borders of Israel in this day. The Arabs wouldn't open their mouths. So there's no Jew that can just be thrown away. Every one of them is necessary. We are all Am Yisrael. Yes?
Does your father have any friends or like family that survived?
He has like far family. My mother had a cousin. I'm trying to think where he was. Do you know where Shiner was? That when he survived, was he in a camp or something?
No, he was in the woods not far.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, he was.
But he was already. The Germans had already made them dig their own. My mother had a cousin. The Germans had already made them dig their own grave. And somebody pulled him back. He said, "What are you doing?" And he pulled him back from the grave, and he survived that way. But every survivor, every one of them, is a miracle. And nobody appreciated what they went through. They themselves can't tell you some of them. Most of them can't tell you how they survived. It's like they come out and they say, I don't understand. It's just like, Baruch Hashem, I'm here. That's all. There is no explanation.
We're going to take 3 more questions.
Okay. You.
Did your father cross any wild animals like a bear or something?
Did you come across wild animals in the woods?
Yes, deer, foxes.
Yes?
How many people were with your father in the forest, and were any of them also Holocaust survivors?
How many people were in the forest with you? Or did it change all the time?
It was changing from place to place, because the Germans was going a lot of time looking in the woods for Jews. There was not one place they settled. It was
You just had to keep
moving
moving.
around.
Yes.
Did your father ever get numbers?
No, he wasn't in a camp. Although I think he was in a work camp, because I was born left-handed. And they asked people to raise their hands if they were left-handed. I don't know if it was a German work camp or whatever. And the people that raised their hands, they killed them, because the machinery is made for right-handed people. So that's how it was. You know, it's like if you weren't useful, you were gone. One more. Yes. Yes.
Did it matter that your father was a Jewish partisan
To who?
to the other partisans?
I don't know. Were you with Jewish and non-Jewish partisans, Daddy?
Oh yeah, it was Jews and non-Jews.
How did the Russians? Mostly Russians, right?
Most of them it's from the army, from the Russian army. Instead, they to fall into the Germans' hands
Yeah.
and going into camps. So they went in the woods to side themselves.
And how did they treat you?
Huh?
How did they treat you, the Russians?
The Russians wasn't bad, the Ukrainians was bad.
I just want you to know that the Russians that survived and the Russian soldiers that survived the war and were taken into German camps were transferred to Russian prison camps after the war. The Russians imprisoned their own soldiers who were taken prisoner by the Germans. Yep.
It's a partisan.
What is a partisan? A partisan is somebody who is fighting, but not part of an army.
So like, people are going against what's happening.
Right, kind of like a freedom fighter, you know, they're just working, but not in a very organized fashion. So there were partisans all over the place. There were partisans in France and in Belgium
And
and
also, was your dad always, like for most of the time, was he in the forest? Or did he move out of the forest into different places?
he was just, were you mostly in the forest? Were you mostly in the forest?
Yes, a lot of, I would say 50-50, maybe more, yeah.
I just
60%.
I just listened to some kind of, YouTube interview with survivors, and the gentleman was also a partisan, and he said, our friends were the cold, and our enemy was the moon. And our friend was the night, and our enemy was the day. They moved around when nobody else wanted to move and be out, because they had to have the weather in their favor. They had to be where nobody wanted to be at a time when nobody wanted to be there.
All right, one final question.
You?
Was your dad ever at a point where he was about to die?
He was wounded very badly by shrapnel in the head, but it actually saved his life, which is hard to put those two things together, because he was taken to taken near Tashkent to a to an underground hospital. And he was able to stay there for 2 years while he recovered.
Okay.